Now we're going to talk about, well, what's anxiety, right? Because they're super closely related. So stress and trauma can be related to things we're actually afraid of. And anxiety is a little bit different. So I'm afraid when there's an external situation, like that dog. Like a dog with its teeth bared, growling, ready. It scares most people. So anxiety is when you experience a more internal, and you might even not know exactly what you're being afraid of or anxious about, right? And it's often not right here. So like if you have test anxiety, you're not actually afraid of the paper and the questions, right? Like those aren't inherently dangerous, right? Unless you're allergic to the ink or something. But what are you afraid of? You're afraid of failing. So that's often that once it's graded, with the implications for a failure and all of that. So anxiety often isn't about the here and now. It really is rarely about the here and now. Like being anxious in a fight with someone you love, you could be anxious that they would leave you if you said the wrong thing, right? But you're not, like the words aren't, it's what the words could mean or what could happen that gets scary. I'm afraid to tell you how I'm feeling. Well, what's scary about that? Because what could happen if you hear me and reject me or get angry, right? So anxiety, like stress, affects your whole being. So it's a physiological, behavioral, and psychological experience. So psychologically, it's a state of uneasiness. It's kind of almost like a negative planning, a ruminating and thinking about what bad things could possibly happen, scanning the future to make sure everything's going to be okay. And then a lot of times when it gets to a clinical level, we distort things. So it's not even realistic. It's like beyond what could, the probability, it's anticipating the worst. And even worse than the worst, right? That, like this is all the 10 different ways it could go really, really bad. And for some people, panic is involved. The top one is the biggest symptom of anxiety, and that is avoidance. So even like we have the physiological ones, like your belly feels kind of uneasy. And now that we talked about how your system shuts down, you get a sense of why you kind of start feeling all of that. But people who are anxious avoid things. And you might, like, let's say you have a paper due for school, and procrastination we know is related strongly to anxiety because it's too big to start. Whenever I start writing a new chapter in a book, I get a huge resistance. And it's because I'm scared about how hard it might be. And when I just start writing, yeah, it's hard, but it's not scary. It's just hard, right? Restlessness, tensing muscles, expressions of irritability, seeking safe places. So that can be avoiding things that you think are dangerous and seeking things that you think. So my daughter, when she gets anxious, wants to be in our room, right? And not in her room. But she wants to, the safe place would be with her parents. Situations or people. And then physiologically. So a little bit different from stress, but not hugely different, right? So shortness of breath, can have a rapid heartbeat, trembling, shaking, sweating, choking, feeling or sensation, and a lot of the same neurotransmitters are involved with stress. So you see a lot of the same physiological. With anxiety, they can be even more. So you're going to see the things you see in stress, but at a heightened level. So you can really have, like, some people feel like not only does the system shut down for digestion, but their body wants to throw up food. You just get rid of it. So some people who get really into a panic attack almost want to immediately get sick. Like the last time I went to Africa, when the plane, our plane couldn't land in New York City, it tapped down and then took back off. And I was stressed and anxious. And people in the plane started praying, and we hit a lot of turbulence. And it was very scary, and nobody was telling us what was going on. And finally, they came over to the speaker. They said we were unable to land. We're going to try again. So eventually, when we landed, it all worked out. I immediately ran to the bathroom and felt like I was going to throw up, and in fact did. And I wasn't the only one. Like, everybody was losing it because it was that scary, right? So that was kind of an example of, I think, anxiety/fear response. And then hot flashes. People can get, it's funny now, if I get nervous on the plane, I'll get really hot and sweaty, stomach's upset, and that's anxiety because nothing's happening and I'm just having that anxiety. So now trauma, so you've got your stress, got your anxiety, and we have trauma. Now, stress has a source, and trauma has a source. And then the anxiety often has more of genetics. Sometimes there's something that happened that can trigger your anxiety, but that's more, we call it like a psychosocial disorder with a genetic risk factor with it. But when we have stress, there's usually an external or internal stressor that you can identify, right? And then with trauma, by definition, there has to be a traumatic event. So in trauma, physical response patterns feel locked in the body. And this is from Levine in his book on trauma. And keep trauma survivors vulnerable and unable to move beyond their trauma. Trauma is so strongly believed to be held in the body that Bessel van der Kolk, who's like the guru on trauma, won't see patients that aren't in yoga therapy for therapy, and he's a psychiatrist. So symptoms of PTSD. So an essential feature is the development of the following. You have to have a direct experience of a traumatic event. And the experience could be that you witness that happening to somebody else, or you learn of it. So your direct experience is that like you're learning of somebody very close to you having the traumatic event. And then it could also come from, in the DSM-5, the new manual, it could come from, did anybody read Slaughterhouse-Five? I just read that on the way to California. It talked about World War II and the bombing of Dresden. And the main character and actually the author of the book had been there during the bombing and survived. And some accounts say up to 60,000 people were killed in that bombing. And the entire city was melted down with fire. They bombed for something like 3 days straight, and the whole city burned to the ground. The person who wrote the book was part of a crew that then had to go in and clean up after and find all the bodies. And so he described it almost like there was almost like glass, like everything had melted so much it was like glass, and they would crash through, and then they would find people in their basements just burned alive, and they had to clean through the city for a long time, so they were in varying forms of decomposition as they did this for that was their job in the war as soldiers. So that, although he survived the bombing in a shelter in Slaughterhouse-Five, is how he lived, his trauma really came from experiencing the cleanup of the other trauma. So people who cleaned up in New York City after 9/11, first responders often get traumatized. People who spend their careers taking Megan, you might have a sense of this, taking the history of people who have had sexual assault histories. And so those are all also counted as ways that you could experience trauma. Does that make sense?
That's what we talked about with vicarious traumatization.
Exactly.
Especially in our careers.
Yep, so that's vicarious traumatization. So you weren't the actual victim, but because you're so close to what's happened to the victim, that you're actually getting the symptoms as if you were there, right? Especially people who are very empathic, right? You're connecting to the trauma. So that's the trauma. And then the symptom characteristics, there's quite a few of them. because it's so when we have stress, that's disrupting. You saw that. Anxiety is disrupting as well. In trauma, it can be as many as anywhere from 85 to 95. 95 is too strong. 80% to some cases I've seen 90. It depends on what study. People are fine, right? And by fine, I mean they're not like clinically diagnosed with something. They are resilient and they survive, right? But many people, a substantial proportion, and it all depends. Now I'm going to go on the other side. I said 85, 90% can be fine, some studies, and it depends on the trauma that I'm talking about. In other samples, as many as 60 to 80 to 90% can be not okay. So it all really depends on the study, the sample. So here's an example of a group that would be at really high risk for PTSD after a trauma. Kids in foster care with multiple placements that have been abused by their parents. And then they're traumatized again. Like that group, super high risk, right? A low risk group would be someone from a really intact family, good socioeconomic status, or well off, or they do okay, a lot of resources, really supportive, communicating family, and there's a car accident, and it's scary, and people get hurt, but everyone does okay. So the odds are lower. So they could be very different, right, how it works out. So here, like with anxiety, you see the avoidance component, but here it's avoidance of things that are related to the trauma. So like for me, I actually never did like flying, but then especially after that time that the plane didn't land, I really didn't like flying. But I make myself, I just flew now, I don't know how many, 6 times, right, in the past month. So I make myself fly anyway. So, but what I really want to do, right, is to not fly. So when I get to go to a conference where I'm driving, I'm all excited. But in order for me to really get where I want to go, and I can't drive to California, I can't drive to Washington, D.C., these places are too far away. It would take up too much time. So I make myself fly. And that actually is non-clinical then, right? Because I'm going. And if I was clinical, and maybe if that had been more traumatizing to me, that plane incident, I would be avoiding it. And I'd be saying things maybe even like, you know, who needs to go to conferences? It's not that important in your career. And right? Or I'd be like, I'm only going to do one a year. It's a stress on my family. Like I'd start making, but the truth is I don't want to go on the plane. I'm just going to do East Coast conferences. West Coast conferences really aren't that useful. I would have a whole set of rationalizations for why I wasn't going on the plane, right? So I'd have an avoidant of things that were trauma reminiscent, and an overall numbing of responsiveness, which is waves in and out with the symptoms of increased arousal. So people have this really like hypervigilant, very aroused and alert and over-responsive, and then this under-responsiveness and avoidance and flatness. And they kind of move. So it's hard to assess because people, depending on when you catch them, could look really different, right? Does that make sense? We call it oscillating symptoms, where you're either really triggered or really shut down. And some people stay more triggered, and some people stay more shut down. It kind of depends on how they express it. So this is Peter Levine's book, An Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma and Restores Goodness. So he talks about the fear immobility cycle. So here you have arousal, unsuccessful escape. So and he thinks that that's like the traumatizing part, is when we really can't be actionable in the moment of trauma, right? I had a fantasy of when Columbine first happened, some of the kids Columbine was a school shooting. It was one of the first massive school shootings I think we had in the United States. And some of the kids had cell phones because it was a relatively wealthy school district, and back then not that many people had cell phones. And I really wanted to study, like, did the kids who were able to contact their parents, whether it be a desk phone or a cell phone, and really reach out and be empowered, did they have less PTSD? And so I tried to get a grant. I even tried phone companies and everything, but I was not successful and wasn't able to study that. But the idea that you could actually be actionable in the moment is protective. It helps you experience less symptoms because you're mobilized. So unsuccessful escape, the experience of fear and helplessness where you really can't be actionable in the moment, and then that immobilization where it's a shutdown. And then you come back to arousal, you might get triggered, and then it's a cycle that's self-perpetuating in times when you're really not in danger, but you're self-perpetuating it. And you end up in this locked down immobilization cycle. This is a little complicated, so stay with me. This is the polyvagal theory, which is like the thing that everybody's in love with right now. And this is from Peter Levine's book. So what he talks about, and I'll talk about it in easier ways, is really how our nervous system works to when we shut down and when we don't shut down, and what we want to do and how come mind-body or yoga interventions would help. So you have your central nervous system, right? Your brain and spinal cord. And your peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, which is not your brain and spinal cord, it's everything else, which helps my arms and legs and my head move, right? I have stuff that's going on voluntarily and involuntarily. Like I can punch on purpose, I can do jumping jacks, right? But there's also stuff that's going on that I'm not making happen. Like I wasn't going like breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, heartbeat, heartbeat, heartbeat. Like all that's just happening. So I'm like doing this and this. And if I did a whole bunch of jumping jacks, my heart rate would go up and my breath rate would increase, right? Just by itself. It's like it's kind of a beautiful thing that I don't have to spend all that time micromanaging my body, right? So under this non-voluntary or nervous system, we have two ways that our body works. One of them is that rest and restore part I told you about, and another part is the fight or flight part. So the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight, like I'm getting out of here or I'm going to kick this situation's butt, right? And then the parasympathetic here is the part that they now discovered. This is like kind of a relatively recent theoretical proposal, is that we have two parts of that system. So one part will shut you right down. And the vagus nerve is your 10th cranial nerve, and the dorsal action in it will shut you down and completely immobilize you. And so what I tell my patients, it's called the dorsal dive, where you're just incapacitated. I don't know, some people have never felt it, some people have, but it's a sense of just kind of and some people even can almost fall asleep or faint, right? Just takes you right out. So this is your unmyelinated, very primitive part of and it's when you really get to complete shutdown. You're just frozen. And then we have our myelinated system, which is really in engagement, and it's connected to your face, your throat, right? Your ears. This is all your communication. So this is when you're mobilized and you can really help yourself. People say use your voice, right? Like there's an actual like kind of biological piece of you that's advanced as like an advanced mammal that makes that happen. That you can read each other's faces, that someone can. I was at a meeting last night, and the person standing next to me, we were getting some information, right? And she just looked at me, and I looked at her. I knew exactly what she was thinking. You know, and it was not good news, and I knew she was upset, and I knew to call her after, just by her looking at me. And we used our social engagement system, right? But had we been so shut down, we wouldn't have even had that, right? Does that make sense? And so, it's like a response system that we can work on. So our clients are people that we're teaching yoga to. Learn to trust that moderate activation unwinds on its own and one doesn't need to avoid or recoil from it. That you can actually be back in action in your life, even when things are hard. Even if trauma, whatever it was, whatever hardship it was, at one point you couldn't be in action, that you can learn to be back in action in your life again, even when it's hard. So when one doesn't interfere with the natural course of one's sensational arousal, it can self-moderate, that you can actually learn to trust your body again, even though you had a traumatic situation that kind of told you you couldn't, right? And that takes work. That takes lots of times really getting your body back in action. Okay. So trauma recovery, mind, body, or somatic approaches that can be useful in the healing effort. So you're going to move out of immobility. So when we're taking people through different postures, through the breath work, through relaxation, we're actually shifting the way that their body is in terms of their life experience. And you could talk about it. We could talk in therapy, and there is good talking therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, that works, right? Dialectic behavior therapy works, but those also have an action and homework component to them. Like, the change is really embodied. And what's great about mind-body interventions is you're doing it in real time, and you don't really need to talk as much because you're shifting the way a person is in their body. Does that make sense? You're getting them mobilized again. So you move out of immobility into sympathetic arousal. So we want somebody to be doing stuff that's kind of hard, right? That's challenging, to get you in that place of, I don't know if I can do this, right? And then through mobilization to discharge and activation, and then toward a new equilibrium, toward staying socially engaged even when it's hard. Does that make sense? So we perceive threat from the outside, but you can also perceive it from the inside. And when you've been through difficult things, or if you have a history of anxiety or anxiety in your family genetically, you can interpret an internal response as a threat when there isn't even a threat there, right? So we assess the threat directly from the state of our viscera and our muscles and our internal organs. So you can be walking around literally stressing yourself out by holding a ton of tension in your body. Have you ever gotten home and just been like, oh my God, I think I've been holding my shoulders like this all day? Or someone that cares about you like touches your shoulders on your back and they're like, oh my God. It's like rocks back there, right? Like you're holding. Like even if you scan your body right now and just notice if you're holding anywhere. Like and I've been talking about a lot of hard things, so you could be like ratcheting yourself up, right? And you just notice and allow and soften. So if our muscles are tense, we interpret this as like there's something dangerous around, even if there isn't. Because your brain and body are communicating back and forth all the time. Does that make sense? So trauma-sensitive yoga is grounded in the physical body. Like it's the opposite of what I'm doing right now. It's not a lot of talking. It's like being in your body. Breath awareness and self-regulation, making mindful choices the whole time you're practicing, taking effective action with positive consequences. So like I want to do crow, right? I'm going to work on crow and I'm going to have blocks ready. I'm going to have an assistant there and I'm going to take one kind of winnable attempt at a time and master it over a period of months, right? But I'm mobilized and I'm taking action and I'm facing my fears and I'm working toward this goal, right? In my body, like wiring how my body's experiencing challenge, as opposed to threat, danger, I'm going to get hurt, that's bad. So the postures have a natural beginning and end too. So you know the chronic stress where you're just like, stressed at every single moment, right? Or PTSD is like, when is it? So here we have, I'm going to work on like a really hard pose, handstand, 5 times, and then I'm not going to work on it. So you have control. You can choose, like this class, I'm going in and I choose today to take knees on every plank, drop a knee on every side plank. I'm going to take this class and breathe through it and focus on my breath and take a knee whenever I can. Because I have choice, and that's what I'm going to do today, right? And then community building, that you're actually doing this with each other. And so you're with other people that are also trying to flip their inverted V or down dog, if it's okay to say in your culture. So here's just general suggestions for yoga programs. And so we've integrated these and more into the mind-body program. So essentially, really working together. If you have the opportunity to have people in therapy where you're doing the yoga or the mind-body intervention, you want the person, especially if they have a clinical anxiety disorder, they aren't managing their stress at all, and definitely if they have PTSD, seeing a therapist, right? In some places that's not possible. There just simply aren't the resources. But if there are therapists there, you want to connect people. You want a strong screening and intake process. So here I'm going to start at week 2, but week 1 of the intervention is all the assessment, where it's a kind of an assessment camp where the whole day you go through assessments. So you really know what people's triggers are, what their trauma is, and what they're coming in with, right? So you have that knowledge. And then you have potential triggers in the environment. You need an environment that's not going to have sudden loud noises, right? That it's a predictable environment, that there's, people can see the door, know who's coming in and out, that there's the ability for everyone to put their backs against the wall and see forward and feel protected. So things that you can create in the environment that are soothing, comforting, and feel safe. Teacher attire and qualities. So none of the teacher behaves in a way that's not triggering. And of course, you'll see in the principles that people taking yoga and ourselves are responsible for our own sense of safety, like we're going to work on creating that. But the teacher makes it easy too, right? That it's a person who does their own work, does their own mind-body practice, and really has a sense of what could be triggering for other people in the way that they talk and the way that they support others. Language, postures, exercises, assists, and adjustments, which I will talk about. And then getting ongoing feedback so that people have an opportunity to use their voice, right, that action part of the mobilization part of their system. So this is the program. This is put together by my research team, Yogis in Service, and Africa Yoga Project. And so I know someone else who has this favorite quote. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. For me, this is the whole program. And that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so whether that response is internal or external, that we're going to learn through the mind-body practices, breath, meditation, inquiry, relationships, that we can create this space to create a new way of being in our lives, right? And it doesn't have to be this and this right away, stimulus response, that we can create a different way of being.